it's too much to ask to thrive, to be able to have some comforts in life and some enjoyments, or must you constantly be just like, unless you're on the brink of destitution, you've
Well,
got
like
to be.
take somebody who makes like 15 or 20 bucks an hour, right? The
Welcome back, everyone. Craig and Jonah here today, and Damien. We've got a guest. Yeah, if you missed the old just Craig and Jonah talking, too bad. We've got better stuff for you now. We've got Damien coming in hot. Damien, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us anything you can about yourself, and then let's start talking.
yeah, thanks, Craig. I'm Damien. I'm Catholic. I recently joined Twitter for better or worse, where I found a lot of fun stuff. And I'm a revert. I had a reversion about 10 years ago. My wife handed me a Brand Petrie CD that filled in a lot of the gaps that I had come to know as an evangelical, non-denominational type of Christian. And then I went down the trad rabbit hole for a couple years, and then I came out of it. And I have the JP2 granny graphic tee to show
Very
for
nice.
it for good measure. I wore it.
Nice.
Yeah. But yeah, the whole post-trad thing, there was like a zeitgeist, and it's in the air, and it's like I found myself like pulled into this current of people who were tired of being miserable, but weren't leaving the Catholic Church. So that's where I find myself now, sort of for the first time properly loving the Catholic faith and properly having, I don't know if reverence is the proper word. I might need like a Thomist to break down whether we revere the Pope or not.
Yeah.
But this sort of like a filial affection for the Pope, for Pope Francis, I guess. So I joined the Catholic Church, and I reverted to the Catholic Church, and I was listening to Taylor Marshall for like my early re-catechesis. So this was like 2016 and 17, and he had like 2,000 subscribers, right? And he was still audio only, so I'd have this stuff going all the time, with all the really, really good information about like the church history and the fathers and like different sects of Protestantism, and in a new light, which was very beneficial for me at that stage. And he was still doing like today it's my little darling's birthday. Happy birthday, darling. Our Latin word of the day is vox. Use your vox to praise God every day. Right. And like very wholesome, like unbearably wholesome, that I didn't think he was a real person, but the content was awesome. And I would just have it going forever. But unfortunately, as the Taylor Marshall went, so too did I over the years. And it led to some dysfunctions and even some tensions in my marriage. And there were some things that off the bat didn't pass the smell test. Like he released the Infiltration book, which I didn't read, but I have no reason to doubt. But at that time, it was already kind of like Vatican II schism type of stuff, and I was putting it on the back burner. But like I wasn't not believing it, but I wasn't believing it wholesale as he presented the narrative. Did you guys read the Infiltration book in any degree?
I was post-trad by then, so
no, I didn't.
I saved myself from that.
I'm aware of it
with the book, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, it just seemed contrary to the things that we talk about all the time, the gates of hell, and like all of a sudden, right? It's like this is the real church, but then in 1965, it's like, okay, well now you have to believe people who write journal articles and run websites, and like that's the way to the truth. And I'm a recreational cult enthusiast, right? So like I recognize some of this cult leader behavior when I found it, where it's like, oh, the shepherds of the church have abandoned you, my flock. You have to come to my website and read all my articles, and and that's actually how you get to heaven. But until 1965, it was the real church. The Vatican II church was the real church. But then Vatican II happened, and now you have to come to my trad website. I should also note that it was like in the same week I picked up a tract on transubstantiation from my parish, and you're going down the click hole on everything, and I was getting these videos recommended to me from the Diamond Brothers, the Vatican Catholic guys.
I don't know who that is.
Well, they're like the premier internet sedes, like
okay.
like the best sedes on the planet, right? But right out of the gate, it was also something that at that level just didn't pass the smell test, because they were like, okay, you have to stay home on Sunday because the Mass is a sacrilege, and if you want to get the real sacraments, they have like this map, and I live in the Pittsburgh area, and there's this town called Greensburg. So I would have to drive to Greensburg and get Mass like in a cornfield that's like not affiliated with anyone, from this 100-year-old man who got ordained before Vatican II messed up everything, and everything's invalid now. So it's like, okay, this doesn't pass the smell test. But sort of the seeds of doubt were like already sown, because they are very persuasive, and it can be overwhelming, especially when you're at the level of like, what is transubstantiation and why does the church believe it? And like the real presence of the Eucharist. And then at the same time, anti-Pope John Paul II.
Yeah. It's a lot of things to keep in the air at one time.
I can remember the first time I was on one of those websites. It was actually Ron Conte's website, CatholicPlanet.com, I think, and I was just like blown away. I'm like, there's only a few valid Catholic priests. What's going on here? But it's very confusing, and it is very persuasive. I agree.
Anybody who utters a word of infidelity to the Catholic Church is late sententiae excommunicated, and therefore everybody is an invalid priest.
Yeah. Well, you must have checked out our. Did you see our video from about a month ago with a Sedevacantist fellow? I can't think of his name.
Yeah. He was remarkably wholesome, I thought, for like. I should preface this. I hadn't been on Twitter in any meaningful capacity before summer 2023, right?
Okay.
So like,
okay,
a lot of that stuff I only knew from YouTube videos where people put on their best face.
Like this is the best you get here.
Yeah.
So are you saying that Taylor Marshall was a stepping stone that brought you to us?
He's at fault.
Yeah.
He's,
well, I would say, do we send him a credit or an apology? Okay. So
he's a primary cause. He's a primary cause in being on this show.
Okay. Not the final cause, but a primary cause. Okay.
The efficient cause. Yeah, he's the efficient cause.
This is stuff I had taught myself to not think about anymore. Now I'm having to use those little muscles in my brain. Okay, so where are you? Bring us up to speed then, or does that kind of put you at where you are right now?
Oh, I would say I'm a massive Paul VI supremacist. I'm a massive Paul VI chauvinist. I'll show it again. I got my JP2 Grandma team to prove it. I got this shirt. I have one friend who's like very secular and a bit of a degenerate, but he has his Catholic friends. And he invited us out. He has 2 Catholic friends, and he invited us out for drinks. He's like, we hadn't met each other. He's like, you guys got to meet each other and have something so cool for you. And I'm like, okay, right? Because we hang out from time to time, and he is a wholesome guy. And we go there, and he presents us with these JP2 matching JP2 grandma tees. And
That's hilarious.
yeah. And I had just finished listening to a podcast at that time. Like, this was a sign. This was part of my de-radicalization downslope. And I had just that day finished listening to a podcast like Top 10 Reasons JP2 was a modernist or something like that. And I'm like, oh man, why can't I just be normal and like enjoy my cheesy grandma shirt?
Yeah.
So I kind of took that as a divine providence that just be normal and appreciate the tongue-in-cheek but also very thoughtful gift. It was like a very fine line what kind of gift this is, and it was a good gift. So I appreciated it, and I thanked him, and I didn't tell him about the top 10 reasons that I had learned earlier that day that JP2 was a modernist heretic.
Had to get to know him a little better first. So that started you on a little different trajectory then, I guess, and then you started. What did you start doing then?
Well, we have a TLM. It's like a half-hour drive for me, but I would go there from time to time. If I was up and the kids were still asleep, usually I'm up first and I take morning shift with the kids. But if I was up and the kids were asleep, I would go to TLM. And before we had kids, I would go to TLM early if we had, like, sometimes she'll go out with her sisters and then they go to mass or something like that. So if we were splitting up for that weekend, I would almost always go to TLM at 8 a.m. and make the drive. But I wasn't there all the time. Most of the time, I was going to Mass of Paul VI, which at that time I did not have a proper appreciation for, and believed. I mean, there are valid criticisms. We in our spheres we talk about these things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just hating it the whole time, which is disordered. I really had no reason to cast that much doubt and animosity on the parish priests in my parish in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. Even, like, we had 2 priests at that time who you would go to confession and they were kind of a hard ass, like grilling me and stuff. I'm like, this is not a soft, modernist, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
What things did they grill you on?
Like interior motives, where I would say, like, oh yeah, bless me, Father, for I've sinned, and I let my kids watch TV all the time because I'm a lazy parent, and then they'll like push me on that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
And but yeah, you read all these horror stories. It was like the clown mass, bubble mass equivalent, like for a confession. Like, most Catholics have never been to a clown mass. Most Catholics have never been to a bubble mass or a streamer mass or an interpretive dance mass.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what gets circulated all the time in the dissident spheres.
Right.
And just like confession, they're like, oh yeah, well, they just give absolution for anything, and they don't believe that half of the things that are sins are actually sins. And that was not even close to my experience at the Normie Ordo parish. Now, I say this, when I was at peak trad, this is 2022-ish, and then the COVID lockdown and the political climate informed that a lot too, in my defense. In 2022, I was at peak trad. I would make the drive down to TLM and do confession from the Institute of Christ the King priest. But some of these things I was learning from the internet Thomists were like incomprehensible to even him. So that was like, that was a big sign to just cool off.
Lighten up a little bit, yeah.
Tim Gordon did this one about, he's all about the role of the woman and female submission and stuff. And his book about that is great. Like, I would completely and wholeheartedly still recommend his book on the patriarchy. But I went to confession all the way down to Institute of Christ the King, and I'm like, hey, Father, sometimes I tell my wife what to do and she doesn't do it right away, or maybe she doesn't do it at all. And he's like, my son, What's the problem? Like, marriages have disagreements. So that was a big sign.
Wow.
I was like, I want my wife to come to traditional Latin mass with me all the time.
Mhm.
It's like, well, what's the problem? My son, he just couldn't understand what I was bringing to confession that I thought was a sin.
Yeah.
That, like, even if it were a sin on her part to not go to TLM with me all the time,
Yeah.
even if it were that some of these trad podcasts and Tim Gordon, if I recall correctly, I don't want to
Mhm.
misattribute things to him that I may have learned somewhere else, but that it's a sin on me for not, like, I don't know, tying her up and carrying her into TLM against her will. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So your wife was less traditional than you were?
My wife is very normal, but the whole family is very devout. I went along with the Taylor Marshall current and, like, internet stuff, and that's how I got into it. Instinct, infallible instinct brought me out of it.
Yeah. Can't go wrong there.
I think the last, I do like to tell this story. The last straw for me, I had all these doubts about the trad sentiments, and the trad movement were just accumulating in my mind over the course of about 2 years, especially once I joined Twitter and I saw sort of like trads in their natural environment. I'm like, holy smokes, like, savage behavior.
Yeah.
And so I had my 2-year-old with me, and I had begrudgingly going to TLM for, like, the true sacraments as they were meant to be and all these things.
Yeah.
And he's 2 years old. I have one kid with me, and this, I mean, 2 years old, 2-year-olds, you know, right?
I got one.
This veiled woman turns around and shushes me. Like, that's psycho stuff, right? Like, everybody's happy to see my kids everywhere else I go, right?
Yeah.
Except in TLM. Where,
This not good enough yet.
so I went home and I had, like,
Hmm.
I wouldn't call it a meltdown, but I was like, darling, if I ever go to TLM, just shoot me in the driveway. Get my gun out and shoot me.
Did she agree to that then, or?
I have many death pacts with my wife, so she's.
This one, I just want you to maim me, get me in a leg or something. But if I cross this line, go for the torso.
Yeah, 2 in the chest, 1 in the head. If I go to TLM again.
Yep.
And not to say anything against Institute of Christ the King or any of the people who go there, but you know, I'm like the king of thinking I'm better than other people for bad reasons. Like, just, I'm 35. I've been through this routine a lot, and I've issued many apologies over my lifetime to real people who aren't necessarily Catholic for, like, you know, I'm sorry for being a dirtbag about that time, right? Times 1,000. And then, so I kind of knew where it was coming from. So I was talking to a guy on Twitter back and forth a little bit that it is possible, like, it is completely possible to go to TLM and not think you're better than everybody else on the planet. But for me, that wasn't the case. So it was also sort of a humility exercise.
That was similar to my. I was much younger. I was more high school, early college age when we were there, and you know, it's hard not to kind of go down that road and become more and more distilled in your traditionalism. And I was just so miserable, in part because I thought all these people out there, none of them are going to be saved because they're not doing all this stuff, right? And I just felt, to me, it was as much hopelessness as it was this superiority thing, although I certainly had that. But I just thought, what is this? Like, this is what you set up, Lord. This is the church, and now we've got very, very few people are ever going to make it to heaven. that was really the intellectual turning point for me. I had to make sense of that. I'm not sure I've totally made sense of it, but it made it much easier when I wasn't deeply entrenched in traditional circles. And now we're going to talk to a dude about universalism on Friday. So we'll talk about a full swing.
You were in high school and college when you were at peak trad?
Yeah, I'm old.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
And then you became post trad? You are truly ahead of the curve. You're a trailblazer on the post trad spectrum.
You know, I chalk this one up to the Lord. I don't know that part of it too is I was at that ripe age where everyone who wants vocations tells you you have a vocation, you should go to the seminary. So I ended up going to the seminary for the diocese at the time, which was a bit of a shock. It was a sort of a shock to myself that I like, sure, why not? But it was a shock to my parents. And then that kind of, when I got into that environment, I'm like, holy cow, this is much more enjoyable than when I left. And I never really went back to it because I ended up in just a Novus Ordo. It was a good diocese, good seminary, but just outside that, trad started to unwind it a little bit, and I never really went back to it, fortunately. So, but without trad, I wouldn't be probably in the seminary. And without the seminary, I wouldn't have met my wife. And without my wife, I wouldn't have this podcast. So you guys got to thank Taylor Marshall a little bit. Just before Taylor Marshall was a thing, that got me here.
Taylor Marshall is, and there's going to be books written about the Taylor Marshall and the trad dissident phenomenon, because there's a lot of, right? So the Michael Lofton thing that happened with Cardinal Zen recently, right? They're saying, the clergy are coming after podcasters, but that's not true. And like they're issuing what was the motu proprio for the TLM 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of it.
Not fiducia supplicans.
Yeah,
the one that limited everything.
Yes,
right? They're doing this because of podcasters, and they'd be like, no, they're not. They're doing it because they just hate tradition and stuff like this. And my experience was completely just following whatever Taylor Marshall was talking about, and then all the things that get recommended to you whenever you're a Taylor Marshall internet dweller. So I was like, I totally get why somebody would come after, do things at their Rome Vatican level because of podcasters, because that was what I was doing, right? And I was going to dinner and spoiling dinner with my in-laws who've been Catholic for 110 years and being like, don't you know that the sacraments are contaminated? It's like, maybe they talked to the bishop. I don't know. I hope they did. Because that's like, listen, my son-in-law, he gets on the internet and he thinks he knows everything now. But he's telling us that all this stuff is invalid and everybody's wrong. And Vatican II was whatever.
Yeah.
So there's word gets out, right? Somehow.
So your wife, bless her heart, through all this. So you were married. You have a young children, but you've been married a while, right?
Yeah, we've been married. We got married in 2017.
Okay, so you were right in the midst of the trad journey at that point in time, right?
When we got married in 2017, I was still. I don't think I knew that there was a TLM society in 2017. That came later, but it was before COVID. So there was a span of like 2 years there. And this is before I got on Twitter. So all the Twitter drama, I was completely out of the loop for what anybody was saying at any given time. I was like podcast overdosing still at that point, which didn't help. And then you talk about living beneath your means. We waited 2 years to take a honeymoon, and we wanted to go to Rome for our honeymoon. And so I took a break. I was like, I just want to go to Rome and enjoy the Catholicism of history and not the Vatican II, blah, 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 blah. So I swore off podcasts for like 3 months leading up to our trip to Rome, which was in 2019. And when I came back, right, and then we had a great time and we saw all the sights and we climbed the dome of St. Peter's and like everything was incredible and it was all amazing. We were there a week and we went somewhere else for a week and we came back home. When I came back home, I was like, okay, time to get back to truth bombs and red pills, you know? So I fired up Taylor Marshall, like, hey, where's Tim Gordon? What's going on here? And I wasn't on Twitter. So I think it was Father Dwight Longenecker's blog. Like, I finally found it. It was on Pathos. I think Father Dwight Longenecker had written the article. But I finally found someone who gave like the play-by-play on that stuff. Had to do with like SSPX sympathies and stuff. But this was like a huge, I say in the most earnest application of the word, that it scandalized me, because I had like these two, they were virtue titans and then they were intellectual titans bringing the red pills and the truth bombs, but then they're acting like total queens over something that is relatively incidental, like not trivial, but like in the grand scheme of things, it's like you guys can't work it out for even just for practical purposes, the big YouTube ad revenue money train that you're all riding right now.
Right.
You can't work it out.
Right.
So that was a big, like a big reality check for me in terms of reconciling internet Catholicism with real Catholicism. Yeah.
So, okay. Now, I have to ask, if it fits into the story, how the hell did you find us then? Like, what?
Oh, your shorts came up this like a couple months ago, like definitely this year, and probably even after the weather got warm, your shorts came up in YouTube. Like, wow, these guys are normal. I had reduced we had an incident. My wife almost died in labor with our most recent one. And it was like everything, like if it didn't happen in my house or like within 1 mile of my house, I just cared a lot less. And this was also a big part of my de-traditionalization, losing momentum on that. Everything else just seemed trivial to a great degree. And there's a picture we have that was shared to me by our doula who was there. And she sent this to me a year later. And it's me in the waiting room with our little girl. And at that moment, I thought I was going to be a single dad as I was holding her. But, we brought her home and she had this crazy, this brutal recovery, brutal pregnancy, brutal recovery. But everything else just mattered less. So my podcast consumption, starting about 1.5 years ago, just went down to almost zero. But you guys came up in the shorts, right? You guys came up in like the little, the 1 minute clips or whatever. And I thought, oh, well, these guys look pretty normal. So maybe I'll try listening to some stuff again. And here we are.
I'm glad you did. I mean, I think that is really why shows like this resonate. Is I mean, we're kind of normal to a fault. I think. Constantly told to hand in our Catholic. I got to take Catholic name out of it because we aren't Catholic enough, I guess.
That's the claim sometimes.
Yeah. So far, they haven't come to repo it yet, but yeah, I fully understand your arc and how it changes, priorities and what your focus is. So your wife, is she happier with the new Damien then, in terms of where you're at now, you think?
It's Yes, definitely 110%. If only because I don't have podcasts playing just constantly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it was one of those things that even annoyed me whenever I was doing it. But I had FOMO. It's like, oh, what if Tim Gordon talks about some new thing that happens in the
Yes.
Curia,
Yeah.
and that's gonna I'll miss it, So,
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I was still, I mean, I think that stuff is always kind of tantalizing. You're like, what if I'm missing something? And one of the things that gave me some confidence and assurance is, I mean, I grew up in the JP2 era, and despite, I think, valid criticisms of the guy, I held him in high esteem, and I probably had a T-shirt like that at some point in time. And then Benedict, yeah, I would wear that proudly. Went out to World Youth Day and all that. And I loved the guy, and I loved just how normal and just loving he seemed. And then Benedict he didn't have that loving personality, but was the the rule follower. And then guys like Cardinal Burke back when he was a bishop, and I got to thinking, like, look, if these guys are fine with this. These guys are doing the Novus Ordo Mass. These guys are, following, Second Vatican Council, all that kind of stuff. Those guys are a lot smarter and holier than me. Like, I had to stop thinking that I have some superior knowledge that they don't have. And if they've got it wrong, the Lord's going to have to just tolerate me being wrong on this, because otherwise there's no one, getting to heaven. And so that is sort of how I developed, was able to reconcile it and say there must be some plan behind this, because there's a lot of really good, smart people that are they're normies. They're not, having mass out in cornfields and stuff.
I agree. It's an exercise in humility, which is something that comes hard for me. And honestly, just anybody really, but I think especially for me.
Yeah.
Just to sort of defer to the God-given authorities, like literally God-given authorities on the matter, and just defer to them. I do have sympathy for the trads still, though, because I call it conversion momentum theory, where when you join the Catholic Church, you're necessarily alienating some people. And especially like if you're a single person, it takes and if you're a single person and you want to be a faithful Catholic who's also like a no birth control Catholic, that puts like 98% of women out of your sphere. Now, I went the opposite way, where I met a Catholic woman, and then I joined extreme Catholicism. So that was like, I did it the backwards way. But you join the Catholic Church, and if you're part of a faith community, a congregation somewhere, you're going to alienate those people. And then especially if it's your family, a lot of people bring up family tensions because of, well, we've been Baptist for 500 years, and now I'm going to be the first Catholic in my entire bloodline. And these are like very difficult things. And a lot of people do give up a lot for the real Catholic faith. But who's to say once you've already annihilated your social life and your family affairs for the sake of your faith, why not just go for the most extreme takes that are out there, right? And that's where the Catholicism, like rad trad online apologist Catholicism comes into play, because you have all that momentum going from like I think Tim Flanders is this guy who hit like every denomination, including Orthodoxy, on his way to the Catholic Church. And I don't follow a lot of these people very closely anymore, so I don't know. I don't want to say that he's a rad trad or a mad trad if he's not. But he was on the Taylor Marshall show a few times, so he's certainly very informed on all the matters. on all the pertinent matters. But once you have all that momentum, you change religions, you change denominations like 10 times in your life based on like purely book smarts. It's easy to get caught up in that momentum and just continue
looking for the next big thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do have, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to this day to the trad arc.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah, again, I feel the same way because I went on that path, and I know, depending on how you get there, for us, I think it was very much liturgical, and that we lived in a very, at that time, a very liberal diocese. Clown masses seemed to be the norm there, and I just wanted to go to mass and not be paranoid about whether the consecration was valid or not. Like, that was the kind of refuge that traditionalism, the TLM, provided for us. And then once you're there, then you just keep getting further and further down. I get that. I mean, I get the attraction for it, when you are constantly being bombarded by things that make your Catholicism or your liturgical life difficult, or at times unbearable. So I totally get how people end up there. And then this question of, what do you do when you're there? I think a lot of people do just become more and more radicalized, I guess, or like I said, more of a distilled version of it, which eventually that wears off. And, so just yesterday, I think I got involved in a big Twitter dispute with Jeff, I think Putnam. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right.
You're right.
He's a very new, excited convert, just became baptized, has a podcast. It was all rah, and he made this statement that he's never met a Catholic who was properly catechized and, what do you say, authentically Catholic enough that left the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, I can give you names, but I'm guessing you're going to just say they are not adequately catechized or whatever.
Oh, Steve Skojek retweeted him. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, so I drug Steve into that conversation. I said, here's the name. And so poor Steve spent all day yesterday dealing with that. But it actually turned out to be I think a very good conversation. But he was the first guy that came to mind, because I remember Steve back when he was a mad trad. In fact, he blocked me on Facebook one time when he was all trad, and I was like, hold on, son. So I've seen the whole arc with him, and that, I think the one thing that maybe a lot of trads end up struggling with, like the stuff that we talk about here that we find, I don't know, just difficult sometimes to understand. I don't know that I could have handled this as a trad. Like, I don't know what would happen to me as a trad. Whereas where I'm at now, I'm still Catholic. I want to be Catholic. I expect I'll always be Catholic, but there's going to be some tensions with some of these things that I'm just learning to live with, right? As a trad, I don't know that I could have done that. I think I might have self-destructed.
And the tweet was, I've never met a former Catholic who was both properly catechized and was legitimately Catholic at any point in their life, because they don't exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's just demonstrably not true. I mean, or it's got to be so narrowly construed that no one ever fits the bill. And so
that's the other archetype that I have a lot of sympathy for, is the recent convert who knows everything. And of course he's in the world where if he's in the South or something, maybe he's just surrounded by people who got gish galloped and left the Catholic faith.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But that's a new convert. You're excited about all your knowledge and the new perspective. And I do have to say, when I had my reversion, it was amazing, right? It's like, okay, so when you're a Protestant, the amount of things that you're allowed to use for reference begin in 1519
mm-hmm.
or whatever,
mm-hmm.
and then go up to the modern day, and they're mostly written by Americans. In addition to, 1500-year gap, and then you go back to just the New Testament. and the Old Testament, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's this whole blank space whenever you become Catholic. It's like opening up a door to a new dimension, right? And it's so exciting. And then on a personal level, the the sacrament of reconciliation, like if there were truly no God and we're all just like chemical machines, the sacrament of reconciliation still has a real effect on, like, I was prone to scruples even during my lapse period, right? Which began when I was about 13, right? But you want to talk about like the most extreme, like, annihilation of your social life for the sake of following the moral code that you made up in your own head. That was me. That was me for a long time. And I lost a lot of friendships over trivial matters. And so sorting out when you're Catholic and they say, okay, speaking out of turn is a matter of prudence or temperance, but not necessarily a sin per se. I'm like, wow, that's cool. I've been beating myself up for 25 years over things I said in 4th grade. You know what I mean? And then you go to confession for the things that are real sins, and it's like magical. It's like I used to listen to Alice in Chains like back to back every single day forever, because that was my headspace all the time, was like mean, miserable white man who's good for nothing, right? And then but the sacrament of reconciliation has this real effect for me and presumably a lot of other people. So when you come in, this is talking about Jeff Putnam still, when you get into the Catholic Church, it does feel like you found a treasure, and you want to tell everybody about it. But unfortunately, he's got like the Skojek ambush. He's got the Kevin non-Tradicath ambush waiting in the bushes to just bayonet him to death at some point in the near future.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give Jeff credit, because I thought he handled it well. I mean, I think he deflected without acknowledging he was wrong, but he really, I thought, handles it well. Because I said, of course, I took this opportunity. So how about a 3-way conversation between Steve, Jeff, and us on our show, and we'll hash it out. But so I'm. It reminds me a little bit of. I like to talk about the 5 Love Languages book, and he talks about the in-loved experience, which is what most people go through, that initial infatuation, and the world's wonderful, and all you see is the highlights and benefit and the positives of your person you're in love with, and you don't see any of the negatives, and then eventually that wears off. I don't care how good you are, it eventually wears off, and now you are in the day-to-day doing dishes together and stuff like that, and you have to work at it. And I think that can happen. I think it eventually will happen, where that, the emotion and the enthusiasm, oh my gosh, this is so refreshing, wears off, and now you've just got to be a regular Catholic, and
you're in the grind.
Yeah, and I think that's the stuff that's ahead of him. And I'm not telling. I don't want to burst his bubble now, but I can sort of see it, and that'll be the true test, is how does he handle that transition, because most of us go through that,
Yeah, I don't know Jeff Putnam. I don't know anything about him, except I learned about him for the first time in that retweet from Steve. Another person I'm not as sympathetic with Steve, but I think he's very interesting. Like you go so trad that I was reading about his experience with that priest. He had that fallout with a priest during the COVID lockdowns because he was concerned for his health, but universal dispensation, something. It was like the last straw. Like I had my last straw of trad Catholicism, but I ended up being a normie afterward for this stuff. Oh, hello.
Push pause or
Do you want me to pause it, or
you waked up? You waked up. Wow. Can you wait hello?
Good morning.
Can you go snuggle with mommy?
No.
Oh. We're in the grind.
Yeah. He's not bothering me.
The sun came up. Okay, buddy, I need you to go snuggle with mommy.
No.
Don't wake mommy up though. If you need to take a break at all to attend to the children, that's perfectly fine.
I think he's coming. There he goes.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, we're in the grind too, right? We're in the grind.
Yeah.
So what do you think the appeal is of like the trad social media presence? Because to me, it's very unappealing and they seem very thorny, unkind. And I'm not sure if it's that there's safety in the rules and so they cling tightly to the rules and they know they'll be saved in the end. And they're trying to bring other people to the rule following.
I think that Kevin Non-Tradicath had alluded to this very insightfully previously, where the trads are trying to make order out of everything, which makes a lot of sense. And I think it's appealing for a certain kind of person, especially when you have in contrast, like the actual crazy real world, which seems to have no order. And then you find people who seem to have all these answers, and they're very refreshing answers, and they're very high explanatory capacity, a lot of these answers. I think that's the appeal. Although I did say to my wife, I was like, I said, darling, if you would have handed me a Brant Petrie CD to join the Catholic Church, and I had been on Twitter at that time to see Catholics in their natural environment, I probably still would have joined just out of his CD on the roots of the Eucharist was just mind-blowing to me as somebody who had spent a lot of time reading the Bible. I used an inductive study Bible, so you have to it's like Isaiah, and then you have to just fill in all the notes and the footnotes. Not a great way to go about things in retrospect, but it forces you to read slowly and understand what you're reading.
Yeah.
I said, if you would have handed me that and I'd have been on Twitter at the time, I wouldn't have been nearly as excited about getting back into the Catholic Church. So I would parrot what Kevin had pointed out on your show a couple weeks ago, where it appeals to people like that. There is a degree of not only I don't think it's as much holier than thou as much as it is cleverer than thou, right? Where you found something that can make you look smarter than everybody instantaneously because you can take a screenshot of something you found on JSTOR and just paste it as a response to somebody without context or without historical information. And then all of a sudden you're the smartest person. You're as smart as you want to be based on the kind of resources you have.
You get liked and retweeted and reinforced by all the people that think like you, and
And it is so weird how disproportionate they are in Twitter compared to real life, right? Like they're in there trolling like Bishop Barron and here's the big Matt Fradd, right? Like they're in there trolling these people who have like very wholesome but normal. Wholesome but normal. Yeah. And just merciless on these people. But in real life, they're hard to find.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, you could just see it. You see someone that posts some innocuous, hey, pray for this family who had a tragedy. And you go into the comments, you know exactly what you're going to find. It's like, you guys can't even just let this go. Just let someone do a normal, wholesome human thing. You got to go there like that. Just, I don't know. That drives me crazy.
Do you think that being scrupulous makes a person more likely to become trad, or do you think trad fuels being scrupulous?
That's a good question. I had super scruples. I gave an oral presentation in 9th grade on this is in a public high school, on not having sexual intercourse until you have the financial means to support a child. This was at a public school on a topic you could pick anything for. And that's what
Wow. How did that go over?
Must have been riveting.
Yeah. Like, you want to talk about when you start to lose friends for your morals. Like, that's when it started for me. You know, and then it's like, oh, well, now here's Ryan, and he's going to talk about why Ford's better than Chevy and stuff like that.
Well, it keeps it like it takes a bunch of the ladies off the market, and at least
removes the temptation.
Removes that temptation a little bit for a while.
To answer your original question, I say this as Lord of the Scruples,
Wow.
Lord of the irrational scruples. To me it was off-putting because early on, whenever I first got on Twitter, Tim Gordon had made a show about other acts, as we colloquially refer to them, other acts and what's illicit and what isn't illicit, and it was very liberal for his platform, right? And this was like week 1 of me on Twitter. And he gets on, and there's people like copy and pasting, untranslated Latin journal articles, right, about like mortal sin for like the most innocuous of the other acts that anybody would ever talk about, right? Mm-hmm. Like anything short of just like being lowered by a crank onto your spouse, like a temptation of the flesh.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Right.
We're finished, baby.
Yeah.
Hoist me back up.
Anyone listening to the audio, you need to go over and check out the video version of this. I'm just telling you. So.
Hoist me back up, darling. I don't want to commit sin.
Yeah.
But the trad people out there were out tradding Tim Gordon, which was another big wake up call for me during my losing momentum on my trad sensibilities. So for me, it fueled Scruples in as much as I thought there's no way anybody could do this. There's no way anybody could live this way for the most innocuous of the other acts. So I think that I think scrupulous people are tempted into tradness, and then it can destroy their life, or they make sense out of it. Because ultimately, I think the Catholic Church is for normal people, right? It's for people that God created, and He said, "Here's my church, and you do these things, and it's all proper guidance." You either believe that or you don't, and you don't believe in this sort of like academically fueled Gnosticism, where you have to know that, unless you're lowered by a winch onto your wife, everything is a mortal sin, and then you get hoisted back up.
Yeah.
So as to not indulge temptations of the flesh. Well, that's all I have to say about that. Did that answer your question, Jonah?
Yes, that did.
Okay.
And I do feel bad for the trad wives that have to use the hoist like that.
Yeah. Talk about a mood killer.
Yeah. maybe not.
Maybe air powered now. You can take a little
Bluetooth.
Yeah.
Alexa, please lower me.
Yeah.
6 feet.
But don't listen to the rest of it.
Yeah.
I'll let you know when you need to tune back in. 2 minutes from now. Well, and I sometimes wonder if that whole flavor of people, if there isn't some of that in, you look at some of the past writings of the saints, and like Saint Alphonsus Liguori, and I was a huge consumer of Saint Alphonsus Liguori when I was a teenager, kind of going into the trad thing, and I was a teenager reading about the 4 last things and heaven, hell, and all that. And that guy strikes me as being on that spectrum of very scrupulous, and I sometimes think those are the types that sit down and want nice, clearly defined, even if they're completely unattainable, but standards, right? That don't leave any room for ambiguity. And sometimes it feels like those people tend to rise to the top in terms of legislating things and deciding what is and isn't licit and illicit. Maybe I'm wrong, but From St. Augustine to St. Alphonsus Gori, I see a common theme there in those people that, and we're just supposed to like unquestioningly accept what they say because they're doctors of the church. Are we? I mean, why is their experience better and more legitimate than mine? I don't know why that is. If it is.
I think that I don't know which universalist you're going to have on your show, but there's one who takes a great issue with the like this sort of dogmatic totemism and dogmatic teleology about things. I think that that sort of everything has its purpose and it's only for that purpose. This type of mentality it informs a lot of these things that we read about as being the most extreme takes possible. I've been maybe you can have like a real philosopher on here to talk about the implications of thinking that of considering that rather than moral acts or immoral acts proceeding from teleology, what if it's the other way? What if teleology proceeds from morality? Kevin Non-Tradicath talked about that example of the handstand, right? Hands are for now. I'm saying this as a person who briefly had kissing scruples. It's like, what's the mouth for? The mouth is for talking, and the mouth is for eating. So if you're kissing your wife, it's an abuse of the lip organ or whatever.
Did you confess that?
No, I should drive down to Institute of Christ the King and see what they say.
Just to be sure, yeah.
Normal. Like, the priest is so normal in the confessional, and that was a big wake-up call for me. But if order proceeds from morality rather than the other way around, it does open up a lot of these possibilities. Like, it is okay to do a handstand because you do a handstand and you're supporting your weight with your hands and you're not impeding the function, you're not impeding the purpose of what hands are for. Therefore, it's not an immoral act, rather than everything having an order and a purpose, and then morality gets interpreted out of that paradigm. Same thing for kissing, right? Like, was the mouth... Now, well, kissing is in the scriptures everywhere, actually, so that's a terrible example. But okay, well, yeah, so, right, other acts, right? A lot of people will say, like, the most innocuous and incidental of the other acts are grave matters and these things. And that's coming from the perspective of the organs have their function, and any use of the organ that is outside of their function is immoral, rather than what I think the Catholic Church teaches and what I hear from priests in the confessional is the other order, whereby if you're not, and this is like RCIA and marriage prep stuff, right? Like, you can't frustrate the purpose of the marital act, but doing things that are not the marital act with the marital organs is acceptable, as long as you don't impede the final cause of it. Does that make sense? It's like
it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me, but depending on who you ask, they may not, they may come down very differently on that. And this is a really important point here, that getting lost in all this is like, I am totally able to embrace, even though I may not fully understand or even totally agree, I'm totally able to wrap my head around the idea that the marital act is sort of sacred and needs to be respected and treated a certain way. And that if you are going to engage in it, there are certain parameters and rules that we as Catholics, as Christians, as humans need to follow. Okay, you got me that way. where it gets lost in translation for me is why does that have to be the only way that married people can express themselves sexually? Why does it have to be that, or complete continence or abstinence? That barrier is the part that I have not seen a good explanation for, and we have an open invitation to anyone that wants to come on and explain that, because that to me is the difference between a marriage that is difficult but manageable and one that is nearly impossible and insufferable. I mean, it's I'm
True.
I'm basing that on 20 years of experience there. So that is where I think in the efforts to in the common response is this teleology. Well, the sexual organs have a specific end and you're frustrating, and I'm like, I don't know. I think it's fine to think about that as a philosophical exercise, but now to take that and say, and if you frustrate that, and it's a grave moral matter that if you engage in it knowingly and don't confess it, you could be spending eternity in hell for one single consensual, loving act, albeit let's say not perfect, between a married couple. That I think someone needs to provide some better support for that, because that just doesn't jive with my experience and intellect.
And then when you combine that with "Don't worry, wet dreams are okay,"
Yeah, right.
I would double down on that take, in as much as, like, the amount of difference between going by the book, right? Completely by the book, super Thomistic morality all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You're still talking about like 95% or more firing blanks.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. But you can. It's like appetite, right? You get hungry every day because you're supposed to eat every day. You're supposed to eat at least once a day, right?
Yeah.
For the sexual appetite, is once a day, 3 times a day, or suppose we say once a day is like as often as a married couple can reliably do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
You get it takes 100 times to get like a guaranteed pregnancy. I mean, I know there's like all the stories like, oh, well, we only messed up once and all the things. I mean, in our experience, we it took her a long time to get pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
which was frustrating. But
Mm-hmm.
it points to the fact that the marital act seems almost designed, if I may borrow a loaded word, designed to be bearing most of its fruit through the intimacy and bonding ends of things. You get the real literal fruit, and like I would defer to the authorities on the matter that if you impede one for the other or the other for one, that it's a moral matter, but the act itself almost begs for an apology, that most of the good that's born from it is from the fruits born of bonding and intimacy. And this isn't even counting the cynical take that it's for managing your concupiscence, right?
Yeah.
Like that's such a cynical take. And I know it's in the New Testament. I know St. Paul wrote it, but it's pretty cynical that it's like,
yeah,
my wife is an outlet for concupiscence. I would die for my wife. I would kill for my wife, like in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
In the right circumstances.
Yeah. Right.
She's so much more than an outlet for concupiscence.
Yeah, that feels very misogynistic to me, not to use that term loosely, but that whole notion that for most couples, the man has a much stronger desire than the wife, especially when you have kids and stuff like that. And the idea that the wife has to be there and available, and of course can't use any birth control, so you got to be, you run the possibility of getting pregnant. As you talked about with your wife, that is not always an easy thing, and people can and do die from it and have very traumatic things. Not to mention now you have, children you got to, you're responsible for, like all that, to manage concupiscence, and let's just be clear, to make sure the man isn't doing something illicit on his own, just seems so disproportionate to me. Like that whole, it's funny because we got into a Twitter fight the last couple of days, and this single guy kind of finally acknowledges the single guy is like, he always talks about it as self-abuse, and I'm thinking, if you're abusing yourself, you're probably doing it wrong. But more more importantly, that's not what's like. If it happens, and we're not here to condone and say it happens, but
no, nobody celebrates it.
No one celebrates. But if it happens, I think for most part, the guy's like, I don't want to burden my wife, right? Like that whole weird dynamic there just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Whereas if there was some latitude, either generally speaking or on the individual couple, on how they can interact with each other sexually when, let's say, they shouldn't get pregnant, that would make a lot of sense to me. But I just can't seem to get a lot of people that want to come on and have that conversation. They're like, oh, here's the script, here's what we're allowed to say, and I don't know. There's a void out there.
We practiced NFP. Grave reasons. Can't do it without grave reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying this as Lord of the Scruples, right? But I was saying 1 Timothy 5:8. If anyone does not provide for his family, he's worse than an unbeliever and has denied the Christian faith. To me, as Lord of the Scruples, I took this to mean anybody who gets laid off has denied the faith and is going to hell, right? So like I went years where I was like, well, I'm making money, but I shouldn't really get married right now, and I shouldn't talk to women because I really wouldn't be providing for my family at that point. So when we were doing NFP for the first 2-ish years of our marriage, before I got a really good job, I have a really good job right now. Okay, really, really good for somebody who thought he would never make more than $20 an hour. Mm-hmm. Growing up, $20 an hour was like balling, right?
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah.
But I have a good job now, so it's a non-starter. But I got a good job, and we finally said, okay, let's have as many babies as you can manage before the plumbing turns off.
Mm-hmm.
And does it count as a grave matter if you're taking one verse of scripture and applying the most extreme take to it that I had done for my entire life? Like me ignoring women because I thought that doing so would put me in hell for incidental, like, job related stuff. Is that real, or is that sort of like the invincible ignorance culpability argument going on there? That's a bit of a tangled thing. But even if we didn't have the sort of like get ahead of all your bills and have a big down payment for your house type of a thing, even if we hadn't done that, my wife's first pregnancy was brutal, right? Terrible pregnancy. Lost all this weight. They finally got her on pills to help keep it. She puked. She didn't keep any food down for 3 months. Lost all this weight. It was crazy. It was horrible. So you had 3 months of that, and then you had 3 months of like relative normalcy. Then it was like 3 months of the end of pregnancy, the way that always works, which is always the hardest part, unless you're my wife, and then it's the first part, which is the hardest part.
Yeah.
Right, and then we go in. She has a C-section. This crazy recovery. For using NFP, if we were called to go to complete abstinence, so as to avoid putting my wife through the next worst thing to hell, 10 times or whatever. That what is a grave matter if not that, right? And then the second time, right, for the second kid, we double up. We're like, okay, we're going to read all the books. We're going to see multiple doctors, take all the weird supplements, do all the things on the books, do all the things off the books. And it was even worse. So she still ended up having hyperemesis for 3 months, lost all this weight, gained it all back, except this time she almost died. And then the kid almost died. So if she were still able to have children, which she was hemorrhaging at the end of it, they had to take everything out to save life. But even if she did, still, we posed the possibility that we would still use NFP, and we would probably use it for 5 more years, because she's, you want to live your life, and all the anti-NFP people talk about, like, you just want to have a big house and you just want to have a boat. Right? It's like, first of all, we're not boomers. People our age don't have boats, right? You want a new iPhone. An iPhone is $1,000. I don't even have one. I spent $110 for this phone 4 years ago, right? So what is a grave matter if not the brutality of pregnancy that some women are afflicted with? And she has a twin sister who had no problems, morning sickness for whatever, a month, but very typical stuff. So I don't understand, but that was something that we had to deal with. And we started off using NFP like from day 2 of our marriage, and then I became more sympathetic to NFP in spite of what anybody would say to its contrary after her first pregnancy, but now especially after her second.
Well, I totally don't get the fight about NFP from the trad side. I'm like, this is like the wrong battle to take. Like NFP is terrible, and I mean, and it's difficult, especially if you are fairly fertile like we are. No one does this because it's an easier way to do things. I mean, so the whole idea, like, criticizing the people that are using NFP seems like such a fool's errand. Because anyway, so that whole mentality makes no sense to me. And then sort of the segue to that is this idea, and I would say this is more of the Christopher West theology of the body as well, is, well, those are unfortunate circumstances. Let's say your wife was still physically able to get pregnant, but obviously would understandably not want to go through that again for the most part. You get to live as brother and sister for the rest, until menopause hits or whatever. And, sorry.
And then it's okay again.
Yeah. Yeah. Then, I mean, those are your options. Your options are potentially risk her life or live as brother and sister. There's no in between. There's nothing you can do to foster sexual intimacy with your spouse during the meantime like that. I'd like someone to explain that without resorting to teleology and ends, because that really breaks down fast for
and
me.
People can't get divorced because of that. And is it worth it?
You have children you're going to raise. Like, are they going to grow up in a sterile, hostile household, or are they going to grow up in one that you still love each other and can enjoy each other? I think people underestimate the ripple effects of trying to live in the same house in a sexually intimacy free marriage. That's just not a good recipe at all.
Mm-hmm.
I am only slightly more than aware of Christopher West in what he does. So the deep lore on Christopher West, I'm not in a position to weigh in on. I will say that he has a YouTube channel. My wife, we have Theology of the Body on one of our bookshelves, and she read it I think as part of her graduate work at Notre Dame, for what that's worth.
Mm-hmm.
And she refers to it off the top of her head. I wouldn't say frequently, but when we're talking about a thing, she'll say, "Oh, JP2 said in Theology of the Body," right? So she knows the material pretty well, and she knows the material better than I do, of course. And none of this NFP stuff was ever a stumbling block for her or us in light of that work done that she had done in school for around theology of the body?
It feels to me like theology of the body was, I don't know, I want to even say the church, in sort of that dogmatic authoritative way, but I think that was the pivot from the old marital debt, sex is only for procreation, to, which I think, like it or not, was very much rooted in the fact that we wanted to tolerate people having sex, and this is the way to permit them, because we know they're going to do it, and then we know they're going to want to do it. But as long as they're cranking out babies in the process, we'll tolerate it. Was sort of, I think, kind of the mindset of the theology up until the 1950s, and then the church is like, people are, that was in the midst of the sexual revolution. People are not going to tolerate this. How do we keep this seeming attractive? And then they kind of pivoted to this theology of the body, and now our bodies and our sexuality are just this divinely inspired, almost liturgical institution. And that's why you need to be so respectful about the boundaries about what is and isn't licit. They've tried to I think go the other way and paint it in such high terms that a lot of people find it unrelatable. But it still poses the same problems of, what do you do if you are in a situation where getting pregnant would be very, very difficult or damaging or financially untenable?
Is that what theology of the body says? That is theology of the body anti-NFP?
No, it's very much pro NFP, but I think most of the theology of the body advocates, and Christopher West being the prime example, retain the idea that you must only have the conjugal act. When we make jokes about the female orgasm has to happen within 19 minutes, that's literally standards that theology of the body folks have articulated, and say, well, because they started to allow other acts as long as it was part of the bigger package, and the process ended the right way, which was, I think, a departure from pre-1950,
especially to please the woman.
Yeah. That was probably the big contribution of JP2, is like, hold on a second, this isn't just a marital debt thing. This isn't just satisfying the man's concupiscence thing. This is a good and wholesome thing for the spouses, and the wives have largely been left out. And so I think he did a service in sort of bringing that up and recognizing that it's not just a transactional make babies or satisfy concupiscence. It's a positive thing for the marriage, but sort of stop short of, from what I can tell, of saying, all right, got to respect the conjugal act, but here's what happens or can happen when you need to not engage in that at all.
Yeah, I'm sad to say that I'm not the authority on theology of the body, even in my own house.
Well, if your wife ever wants to come on and talk about it, let us know. I mean, I think theology of the body is an attractive alternative to that old marital debt, satisfy concupiscence way of things. Like, I get the attraction there, but it's not without its own limitations and pitfalls. And I've said this before. If theology of the body is sort of a stepping stone to a better, more wholesome approach to it, great. But if that is the end of the road, which I think it's treated as, there are just as many question marks about theology body and how that plays out in practice in marriages as the alternative, maybe even more so.
Yeah, I sympathize with that with that framing. Although I do have to admit that my conscience is bifurcated on the matter, because on one hand, the marital act itself almost seems to beg for its primary fruit to be bonding and togetherness, as we were talking about previously, to such a frequency that even under the most natural circumstances, you're talking about 90, 99%.
Yeah.
No conception, right?
Yes.
But then, on the other hand, I did come into the church. I was like, wow, I like the rules. I like that there are rules for everything, right? And me being a rule follower, it was like, peanut butter and chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
So I am, for my own sake, deferring to the authorities. For the same reason that we deferred to the authorities for NFP, would be the same reason we defer to the authorities for the other matters,
Yeah.
the other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't fault that at all, and what I would say is, and maybe that is the prudential way to handle it. What I think happens in practice is you have that out there as the official standard, and then what kind of happens on the localized level, sometimes between priest and individual, is, well, here's how you can do it, or this is okay for you. And I know some will say the priest shouldn't be doing that, but I think it tends to get handled sort of quietly on an individual basis, which, I mean, I guess that's better than the alternative. But the problem I have with that is there are couples out there who are doing everything possible to follow the letter of the law to a T, and find that creates an enormous burden on their marriage, where they are going months, if not years, without any sort of physical and sexual intimacy. And some will say, well, that's just the cross they have to bear. Life is hard, suffering, crucify your flesh, which I'm not telling anyone they shouldn't do that. More power to you if you want to do that. But what I have a struggle with is to say, well, if you can't do that, or you choose not to do that, you are now committing grave matter and your soul is in jeopardy. Like, that is where I keep coming back to, is in practice, that is such a high, almost impossible standard to follow, that I consider that heroic virtue. But the heroic virtue isn't, well, now you are really saintly level. No, that's just the basic threshold to be a good Catholic in a state of grace. And anything below that is now a grave matter that you need to take to confession and hope for God's mercy. That is where I really struggle, and that's why we continue to talk about these things, because there's more than an insignificant number of couples who find themselves in that struggle.
It does point one in the direction of hopelessness and despair from our perspective here, because normal people who aren't caught up in these discussions, for better or worse, they right, like me, people like you and people like me and the people in our circles, we're so keyed in, and not even just like in an online level, but like our consciences are so sensitive to these things. And it beggars belief, me, not a doctor of the church, but it beggars belief that only the extremely sensitive conscience and the highly informed, compulsive reading material archetype would be the type of person to go to heaven after he dies. Like I made my brother, I have a kid brother. Well, he's 21 now, but whatever. I made him godfather for my daughter, right? And he's not officially godfather yet, because he has to get confirmed. Because he got baptized but not confirmed, because my family is half Catholic and half fall-away Catholic, so whatever. But for a person who just wants to go to work and make money and have a normal life and then go to church, that's just normal people, right? And I do this is another contrast to the trad thing. I just think that most people inside of Christendom have been normal.
Yeah.
In France in the year 950, I think you just had normal people, and not like, wow, Bishop Bonneray, he wrote this new letter to the parish congregation that says, whatever, lower yourself from a winch onto your spouse.
I love that image, by the way.
Thou shalt install a winch in your stone house to have illicit marital activity.
If you're supposed to cut off your arm if it causes you to sin, a winch doesn't seem all that out of line. So I think that's absolutely right, and it's sort of like ignorance is bliss. I think 200 years ago, people were just trying to like survive day to day and whatever. They weren't getting uptight. I suspect they were not getting uptight about this, but maybe life was such a struggle that the stuff we talk about was just a pure luxury. Like, hey, we can do it, the change of the season, the equinox. That's our time to do something. I don't know. Maybe that's what life was really like, and this is a modern day first world problem that we have here. But
I don't know. There was no Netflix back then. They were doing something.
They were doing something in the twilight. But and I do. When I go to mass, and we go to a Novus Ordo mass, it's a good mass. But I sit and I look at these people, and I'm thinking, you are not dealing with the stuff that I think about. For better, for worse, you are not bothered by this.
That's true, and that's the environment that I grew up in, where it was just the Novus Ordo, and I thought we were traditional as far as like we prayed every day and we tried to live our faith, but we weren't, the scrupulous form of Catholicism, which maybe saved me.
Yeah, that's where I'm sort of stuck between two worlds, because that's the world that we're in, and then on the online world, I'm fighting with trads who look at me, and we have 9 kids. There's never been a birth control pill within 100 months. Yeah, like that. And yet it's still not good enough. Craig, your soul's in jeopardy if you don't roll the dice on number 10. Like
hey,
literally.
I'm curious. How do big families get around?
Big vans.
Big vans or 2 vans. We're a 2.
That's true. Some people use 2 vans.
Yeah.
2 vans. Because I bought an 8-seater. For the first time in my life, I bought a new car 2 years ago after I paid off the house. Bought a nice 8-seater SUV.
Oh, wow.
And then I get on Twitter, and because my wife's family, her dad had 11 siblings, right? And that's like unprecedented. Like I'd never even heard of that. But then all these people online, I get on Twitter, and everybody's like, wow. Airport shuttles, like, what do you even do? You have 2 vans. That's incredible. You drive one and your wife drives the other.
I have kids that are driving now too. So, my favorite fleet is Toyota Sienna minivans that hold 8 people. But we have a big 15 passenger van that's just clinging to life that we consider replacing, but
those are expensive, man.
They're a $40,000 investment for a newer one, and
with kids, they're going to depreciate quickly.
Yeah. My wife's Christmas gift was a gift certificate to have her van detailed, and when I bought that, I'm like, you guys are going to lose money on this one, because wait until you see what we bring into the shop. You will not believe the places you can find goldfish crackers. But yeah, I mean, that's the reality. Like we, just finding housing and grocery shopping and like we took the whole family out to California. I'm literally just throwing $100 bills out just to get in an Uber, just to go for breakfast. Like that.
Uber, how many Ubers? Do you have to triple book?
Yes, multiple, and we'd get turned down because I didn't have a car seat in the one. So it's just it's life. I mean, and humans are very resilient, which I think can give the perception that, oh, there's no big deal. It's no problem to have 8, 9, 10 kids. Well,
or to abstain forever.
Yeah, like people survive, but that doesn't mean that should be the normal. Like survival mode should not just be assumed to be what's expected. I think
it's not thriving.
Right. Like, yeah, is it too much to ask to thrive, to be able to have some comforts in life and some enjoyments, or must you constantly be just like, unless you're on the brink of destitution,
Well, like take somebody who makes like 15 or 20 bucks an hour, right? It's almost like we have to practice. We're called to practice this virtuous life, and it's very good. And you practice the 4 temporal virtues, I think they're called, and then the 3 theological virtues, right? But when it comes to your means as a provider in conjunction with how big your family is or should be, it's like prudence goes out the window. Prudence doesn't count here. Prudence doesn't count here, says the trad, says certain documents, because that's a frustration of the ends of all the things we talk about.
Yeah.
It seems like an oversight that right? Like I could afford 10 kids, but somebody making 15 bucks an hour or 20 bucks an hour through no fault of their own, right? Some people just don't have it in them.
Yeah.
Are they called to be like have their back to the wall for the rest of their lives?
And this is a really good point. And this of course got me into a Twitter feud last week. But so there's a poll on the Uncharted Catholic Man page right now. I think it'll be done running when this episode comes out. But I asked, you got to have a serious reason to use NFP. Well, is there ever a point where you have a moral obligation to use NFP? As opposed to just, well, if we get pregnant, we get pregnant. And so right now there's 35 votes, and 43% said it can't be sinful to procreate. 23% said it could be sinful, but that is mind-boggling to me, how you could be committing a mortal sin if you use NFP without grave matter, but you can just carelessly and imprudently, recklessly just get pregnant. That can't be a sin. That makes no sense to me. Like, I don't know how that could possibly be true. And sort of in follow-up to that, if you truly accept either the rigid theology of the body version or the old Father Rippinger version, whatever, I would strongly discourage people from getting married young. I would say wait as long as you can, get into your 30s, get financially secure, and then just have babies and stuff. And even then, that's not gonna be easy. And yes, you may have missed a fertility window, but that young fertility window, when you are just trying to scrape by and make a living and trying to be a perfectly faithful Catholic in terms of your sexual intimacy and what you do when abstinence comes for you, whether you're using NFP or not, it's coming for you. And
you're trying to build a foundation with your spouse.
Yeah, that to me, that just seems like a recipe for disaster for most people. I think pick one or the other. Have people marry young and have kids often, or encourage them to wait if you're gonna rigidly follow these impose these rules. I think that's my cynical take. I don't know.
No, that I don't think that's cynical at all. In fact, what I tell people in real life and online is, if you are a man who wants a big family,
mm-hmm.
you should not even talk to a woman until you're either you have a 6-figure salary or you're like 30 and you have accumulated equity and assets and stuff like that, like very sensible things. If you're a woman, you also have to find a woman who wants a big family. But so the whole fertility thing, right? Okay, if you want to have a big family, you have to get married very early. But if you're a woman and you want a big family, you have to, you really should be open to marrying men in their 30s, right? When I was 20, I was retarded.
Yeah.
Okay. Like when and even then I got out of college, and it took me years to find a good job that wasn't also a seasonal job.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to stay in my hometown. I'm from a very small town. I tried to stay in my hometown, but I was just tired of making like $9 or $10 on junk ass jobs, no matter what I did. So I did move to Pittsburgh area, and even then you start out like from the bottom, and then you have to build your skills and work your way up and do all the other stuff. And I do make a 6-figure salary now, but I'm 35.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, most people my age, most of my peers they don't look like they make 6-figure salaries. They don't have lifestyles like they're making 6-figure salaries. So both people getting married young is terrible advice.
Mm-hmm.
The man and the woman getting married young is terrible advice. And I'm gonna die on that hill because there were several years where I was living with my back to the wall too, and not working 40 to 60 hours a week. You're just desperate. You're not poor. It's like you're not quite poor.
Yeah.
Because
you're not thriving. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this was me not talking to women back then either, because I thought that if I took on children and then I couldn't provide for them, that I had denied the Christian faith. So I was still taking this extremist take. You had Modern Papist on a couple shows ago, and he actually corrected me on Twitter and showed me like what the USCCB says about that. I'm like, you mean I've been shredding my life over an extreme take on an ambiguous Bible verse for 20 years? And that's what I was doing. But yeah, I'm dying on that hill. I don't think you should have a big family as like an ontological morality, of course. If you want a big family and you're a woman, marry an older man. Be ready to marry a man who's 10 years or 12 years older.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a man who wants a big family, you really have to thread the needle and play your cards right in your 20s. And you have to not be fat when you're 30, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to take care of yourself, right? I'm 190. I can do 50. I would like to be 170. I can do 50 push-ups in a clip on demand, sometimes more. I can still run 5 miles on demand, even though I would like to lose 20 pounds. But I'm not trying to court a 20-year-old woman to give me the most fertile years of her life.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, and we married young, and I went to graduate school, and we started having kids right away. And I'll be honest with you, it's been in the last few years, well into our 40s, before I started making the kind of money that it wasn't constantly like, gosh, here's another bill. Now the washing machine broke, and now that, like, and I've always had a decent job, and now I have I'm making really good money, and we're far from financially comfortable. Like, I totally agree with you, and I love having a big family, and I'm glad that my wife and I got married when we did, but it was a much more difficult process, and it continues to sort of impact our family. The fact that we did that without any real good way of slowing the pace of having children.
Some of these influencers, some of these online personalities, there's no way that all of them are bootstrapping Catholics who made they got married at 18 or 20. And there's no way that at least some of them didn't have help from home, that's super. Like, if you get help from your parents because your parents are well-to-do, I think that's awesome. I'm not against that at all. I'm not against nepotism. Nepotism is based in red pill, as long as it's within your family. But I do wish that some or all of them would be more forthcoming about the kind of support that they received when they decided to get married at 18, 20, 22. Because some people get gifted homes. Like, that's an incredible blessing. And that's my plan. Like, my plan is just to put up my kids as comfortably as possible after they get married, and then hopefully like retire into their basement. It's like, that's my plan. So I'm living out what I'm talking about here. But it's at least disingenuous to maybe even lying by omission to tell people kids aren't that expensive.
God will
without,
provide. If you have babies, God obviously will find a way. And I'm not here to say that that's not true, but I think that's kind of presumptuous to
yeah, prudence
just
goes out the window. Like, why do
yeah,
we have to say God will provide, and
yeah,
then we
yeah.
have a million Bible verses and a million church father citations about the importance of practicing the different virtues?
Mhm.
I'm dying on that hill.
Yeah, good. I think that needs to be said because it doesn't get said anywhere, especially in trad circles. And I think this is, I mean, I think this is the reality that someone needs to answer for and explain because, like I said, I think there is this misperception out there that just you know have babies, put yourself in a providentialist mindset, and just assume that that's the virtuous way to do, and everything's going to be fine. Maybe for some people it works, but for a lot of people that's a really really difficult road to follow, and a road that I think is just going to set you up for the kind of struggles and things that we talk about, moral struggles that are going to come along. And at least be aware of what you're getting yourself into. We're here if nothing more than to inform people of, like, okay, this is what the real life is like. If this is the road you want to follow, realize this is what you're signing up for. And maybe some people should delay marriage or avoid marriage entirely, or maybe we need someone to be, priest or whatever, to be like, okay, this, you're being scrupulous here, whatever, because there's just not enough of that out there, I think.
That's for sure.
And people will say this. I don't have the stones to have this conversation in real life. Although I haven't had the opportunity. Maybe I will.
Okay, all right.
I'll let you know on Twitter if it ever comes up. But
Okay.
people always say, right? Oh, well, my grandparents lived in a one-room shack and raised 15 kids, and we all had bread and water every day for our entire lives. It's like, well, your grandfather was a bad provider. I'm sorry you had to learn this way, but that you're literally malnourished and like not properly sheltered in some of these circumstances. Well, my granddad, we lived in the jungle. We humped it in the bush and foraged for berries every day. Like, somebody's dropping the ball here. You and your 15 kids. Your one room hearth shack. And it's harsh, but this whole idea of being a good provider it's the other end of, it's the flip side of that coin, where it's demanded of you, and it gets harder to do in modernity. We're not talking about buying new PlayStations and brand new cars and new iPhones every year. We're talking about, it's like $1,700 a month for this broken down hoarder's home that went up for rent, like 2 blocks from me. I'm not even in a rich neighborhood. $1,700 a month for rent. That's crazy. So I agree.
Yeah.
Some people have to learn it that way. It's like, I'm sorry that you had to learn it this way, but if your grandparents foraged for food in the field and there were 15 of you in a single room, somebody was not a good provider after the year 1930. You know what I mean?
Well, and even if you kind of like take the trads, not to keep picking on the trads, but just as an example, like, the marvelous things that the church, the institution, has done in the past, some of the cathedrals we built, even the Latin Mass and all of the ornate stuff, the altars, the incense, all of this amazing product of human creativity and work and intellect and creativity. But when it comes to the bedroom, you're just supposed to be cattle, like just whatever comes naturally, just marital debt, and we're just supposed to operate at just such a base naturalistic, but not when it comes to other stuff, but just this very naturalistic unintellectual process that I don't get that at all. Like, why are you, what's the reason for that? Is it we just not caught up? Do they not? I think for a lot of people this is just easier, especially for guys. I'm going to call it guys. Being able to live that way and to invoke the marital debt just makes it easy for lazy, sloppy men to get what they want and not have to do the hard work of improving themselves, financially, personally, fostering love for their wife,
Being jacked, being fit.
Yeah.
That was big fit.
There we go.
Oh.
That's it, that a boy.
That's right.
Big sloppy man with, you know, like
Yeah.
rolls and stuff. Being like, assume the position, dear.
Yes,
We're collecting the marital debt.
that's right. Yeah, that's the appearance I have in my head, and maybe that's something of a caricature, but certainly that the model works for those guys.
Somebody's been doing it that way.
Yeah.
Like, the archetype is there.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of Catholics.
Yep. So I think sort of relying on these sort of older views is I think it forgives and tolerates a lot of bad behavior, I think is what I would say. And I think that's something that needs to be said out loud. So here we are saying it out loud.
Mhm.
So anyway, well, I could talk forever, but we definitely have to do this again. I think Jonah has to go slave away here in the coal mines here soon. So
Yeah, I gotta get psyched up for my cozy remote work software job right now. So,
stop. Yeah, well,
sorry, bros.
that's hey, more power to you. I'm very, very happy that you are doing what you're doing, that you've found your way to where you're at now, and that you're not still binging on Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon and stuff like that. Binge on us instead.
Yep.
But so hey, before we wrap up here, any final thoughts? Anything that is just burning on your soul that you want to get out there before we wrap this episode up?
No, thanks for having me on, and thanks for sliding into my DMs for the invitation.
Yeah, I'm glad we did. I saw you show up, and you hadn't been on Twitter long, and that's why I at first I didn't. I'd like to see people on Twitter for a while, so I know what I'm dealing with. But I'm really glad I reached out to you. We should get you into our Discord community. I don't remember if I invited you. If not,
I'm in there, but
okay, all right. I couldn't.
I'm
remember.
online too much as it is. So
we all are. So I've really enjoyed this, Jonah.
How do people follow you on Twitter? I love the interactions on Twitter. I don't think we've mentioned your handle yet.
I'm Kevin James fan, as in a fan of the comedian Kevin James. He hasn't followed me back yet, so I'm still waiting for that.
Well, Kevin James, if you're listening to this, here's your biggest follower. Make sure you follow him back. I honestly didn't know who that was. I didn't know if that was a basketball player or whatever. So
what? Oh my gosh,
dude!
You don't know who Kevin James is?
I do now.
It's not LeBron James's brother.
What? That's close. I'm too busy podcasting and raising 9
but
kids.
I mean, don't follow me. I don't post all that much. I mostly just reply, and I rage bait.
Your replies are great though.
Yeah, if you follow one of us, you'll get to interact with Damien here. So definitely do that. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad we did it, and maybe we can do it again sometime. So
yeah, it was great talking to you in person.
All right. Thanks, Damien. Thanks, Jonah. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
You bet.
And until next time, everyone.
Bye.